Welcome to this recording of a message for Sunday the 2nd of August as we continue our reading through Matthew's Gospel, and today come to the familiar passage in chapter 14 of the feeding of the 5,000. At verse 13 I read, "When Jesus heard what had happened," and that's the beheading of his cousin John the Baptist, "he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they may go to the villages and buy themselves some food.' Jesus replied, 'They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat.' 'We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. 'Tell the people to sit down,' Jesus said, 'and bring them here to me.' Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up into heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was almost 5,000 men, besides women and children." If you've been following with us either on Zoom or here on YouTube over the last few weeks, you'll know we've been listening together to kingdom stories that Jesus, the master storyteller, had been telling both a large crowd and his intimate band of followers. We've immersed ourselves in these stories as we've sought to glimpse signs of the kingdom around us and understand who we are within it. This prompts some serious self-examination to ensure that at the last, when judgment comes, we are sorted into wheat and not weeds, good fish and not bad. Like the tiny mustard seeds growing to large trees, or the little amount of yeast that makes the dough rise, we, small and insignificant that we are, might see ourselves as having the potential to grow for Christ and his church and help build his kingdom here on earth. The stories that fill the Gospels often illustrate the parables Jesus has been telling. We can spend hours trying to unpack them, teasing out their meanings, looking at the characters, the setting, the narrative, listening to the comments of bystanders. Almost every time we read them, we glean a new insight or angle into what is being said. Today and for the next few weeks, we don't listen to Jesus telling parables, but our gospel writer shifts the narrative to record Jesus performing miracles. To our rational, ordered mind, parables can be interpreted, whereas miracles are perhaps more challenging to explain. We like to have a clear explanation to aid our understanding in order to be convinced. I'm sure that there are those of us who could quite happily accept Jesus' teaching. We recognise that he offers us a model for society, how it should operate and live, which, challenging as it may be, is a goal for us all to aim for. Yet, looking at the accounts of Jesus performing miracles, we might more readily throw our hands up in disbelief. Because we were not there, because we were not eyewitnesses, there's a danger that we try to belittle some of the miracles or find convenient explanations in order to make them convincing or believable. Today we are looking at the familiar account of the feeding of the 5,000. Actually, as Matthew reminds us, the head count was just of the men. There were women and children there too, so the reality is the crowd could have numbered 1,500 or more. Or perhaps, if we assume each man took a wife, girlfriend with him and their families, with 1 or more children, so the figure grows. Feeding 5,000 is miracle enough, sufficient to make us think. Grappling with the reality of the miracle benefiting an even bigger number becomes even less credible to our minds, doesn't it? We would be probably looking to feed at least everyone living in warmer, if not more. With the sheer numbers involved, it's no surprise that this is probably the most readily remembered miracle of Jesus. All 4 Gospels record it. It's not hard to imagine that there were Matthew, Mark, Luke and John starting their research. It was easy to find eyewitnesses. Everyone knew someone who was there, if they weren't there themselves. So it was a popular "do you remember the day when" kind of story. Perhaps too, of all the miracles, it's the simplest of one to explain away. Next week, Jesus walking on water seems a physical impossibility. Excuse me. Here, a large crowd who have left home for the day to wander out into the isolated countryside to hear a popular preacher with their family and friends, that they would do so without being prepared at some point to eat is inconceivable. It squares conveniently in our minds to explain away this miracle when the little boy, actually only John's Gospel mentions him, offers Jesus' disciples his packed lunch, seemingly all they can find. That when Jesus starts to distribute it, it's the catalyst for everyone else until then, who have been listening to Jesus' every word, to break out their own picnics, and the great feast begins. Of course, we don't know if that's what happened. As we're presented with it by all the gospel writers, Jesus took a simple packed lunch and distributed amongst a great crowd, and by the end there were 12 basketfuls left over. Wow. A mind-blowing picture. And where were we last week? We were listening to stories, growing the kingdom out of little things. A small, insignificant mustard seed, a small amount of yeast, with the potential to make a big difference, to grow into a tree that would bring a plentiful harvest or be part of a dough that would expand and spread. We must be careful not to overlook the context in which this great miracle is recorded. The gospel narrative which we've been reading together has skipped the record of Jesus' cousin John the Baptist brutally beheaded by Herod to please his scheming wife. Jesus has been seeking solitude to reflect on the loss of a relative, finding himself pursued by a large crowd, anxious to know what this rabbi will do next in the light of the obvious threat from the political as well as religious leaders of the day. So it is then that in this barren countryside, faced with huge gatherings, anxious to be fed, Jesus acts and he feeds them. Is it food for thought here, I wonder? We might reflect on the potential growth of the God's kingdom we've seen in the parables from the smallest things. And Jesus' miracle shows the reality, a little food at the beginning, and everyone with more than enough left to go on feeding even more. We claim to be kingdom builders, yet do we give of ourselves of that calling? Do we have the courage, the confidence, the faith of the one who gave his lunch that the crowd might be fed? Matthew chooses not to identify him as a small boy, perhaps so we don't get overly focused on him. The selfless act of giving up all that he had could have been done by any individual in the crowd, man, woman, adult or child. We remember the treasure hunter and the pearl merchant gave everything they had. Laudably, Jesus' disciples saw the need of the crowd and said, "What can we do?" But their response was wrong. "Let's send them away." Jesus showed them a different solution, using what they had, and all were satisfied. As I reflect daily upon the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, national life, grieving families, and for the most part closed churches, I cannot help but think our hand has been forced. We find ourselves out on the street where we are to sow seeds and gather in the harvest, where we are lone voices speaking for truth, justice and love. Scattered across our community, this is where we are to be witnesses and workers for the growth of the kingdom. Our words and actions can best be heard and seen, not in our buildings but out in our community, where we rub shoulders with those we are called to witness to. Recognizing our community's needs around us, we must seek to respond as Jesus teaches us how. Small and insignificant that we might see ourselves and our own gifts and talents to be, by offering all that we are to God, for Him by His Spirit, as we began our worship today by singing, to melt, to mould, to fill and to use. Then the kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. Food for thought. Amen.